How's the inner work going? Mindful breathing, sensing the body, aware of the flow of air in through our nose, back out again.
Eh,
Yeah.
still some of the trouble that we've talked
Yeah,
about
still some of
recently.
those turbulations. Yeah.
Yeah, the tribulations. I have had more of an opportunity or more of a reminder to sense the body. I've been doing that more often, and I don't know what it is. I feel something building inside for I don't want to jinx it, but I feel something building for starting for getting back on getting back on the horse again.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so which is nice. I'm excited. There's something in me is excited again.
Yeah.
I
Well, I
wish I
mean,
had a better handle on what it is.
yeah, it goes in waves. Sometimes we have more energy for the work on ourselves, and I mean, it's all related to C12. When we waste that and blow it up, we don't have really the energy to work on ourselves. It kind of gets stolen and distorted by other parts of ourselves, and we get lost in imagination and identification and daydreaming and negative emotions and excessive movements and formatory thinking in various different ways. And but these are all natural. Everything goes in an ebb and flow. So we go down and then we go back up, and then we go down and we go back up. And so it's good that you're coming back. Um, so
For sure.
let's just try to bring ourselves back into our physical body. Mr. Gurdjieff, well, he didn't quite say it the way I say it, but he did say it. The most important single step that we can take is to first develop a real sensation of self. That's the mindful awareness of our body and the mindful awareness of our body brain. So to be aware of our body, to be aware of gravity, balance, temperature, air pressure, to be aware of the internal and external sensations. So the internal sensations, such as the sensation inside our stomach, bladder, colon, inside our lungs, our esophagus, the external sensations, the air that touches our face, the touch of clothing on our body. This is very important. And the reason it is very important is because if we think of ourselves as a triangle, as three-brained beings with a head brain, a body brain, and a feeling brain, it's very important to begin with the development of the body brain so that whatever we do, if we can hold that awareness, if we've grown so strong and capable of being physically present and can hold that awareness in the back of our, sort of in the back of our awareness, but consciously with intent. By doing this, it blocks problems from happening. Mr. Gurdjieff said that one of the problems with a lot of people as they age is that they are unable to receive a new impression. And this is one of the major keys to understanding his major work, Beelzebub Tales to his grandson. Because he presents, for instance, something like 450 neologisms. In other words, words that he invented. Because language is such an automaton. It's such a part of our subconscious mind. And unless we go and learn a new language, we have very little opportunity to encounter words for the first time. And so a big part of that book, when he said, read it first, as if you're reading a newspaper, and then read it second, as if it's out loud, and then read it a third time. He was also talking about, something slightly different. I've had a number of people over the years who started it, and I must have started that book 50 times or 20 times and never got beyond the 50th page. I remember reading it back in the 80s, reading up to the 50th page kind of thing, and thinking, this is ridiculous. Who is this guy? This is the worst writing. And I didn't have the comprehension and the understanding of what he was trying to do. So
we lost you for a second there, Alan.
Okay. I didn't have the understanding of, I think I just somehow switched internet connections. So I'd read the first 50 pages about 20 times, and I couldn't get beyond it. I couldn't get beyond all the words. I couldn't get beyond everything. And people have subsequently come up to me now that I've read it, half a dozen times and listened to it half a dozen times. They want to get some kind of guide or index to the words. And I think that's the worst thing that a person can do. I think it's best to approach that book without really knowing what's going on. I've also had a number of people who want me to start quoting tales on my Facebook page, and I refuse to, because I don't want to give people sort of an inkling beforehand so that they have an impression beforehand. But I believe it's in page 1173 of that book where he talks about actually the process of self-remembering. He's got it hidden there. He calls it I forget the phrase he used, but the difference between understand. It's about the reason of understanding, where he talks about the thing that I was mentioning earlier about old people being unable to receive a new impression. I once met with this old man, and everything I said reminded him of a story of something that happened in his life. So it's like every word pulled something up from in him. And the pulling something up from in him was actually in the first position. So he was unable to receive a new impression. And the way we prevent that from happening is to hold this awareness of our physical self in the background so that we are able to fully and properly receive new impressions without it triggering something else. These words that I'm speaking, I'm actually making a bunch of sounds, phonemes, according to the linguists. To me, they make sense. They're associations that I've learned over my lifetime. You are not hearing my words. My words are calling up those associations within your mind that have already been planted there. So we think, okay. Just switched internet connections again. I'm not sure where I lost you, but you think you are hearing me, but the sounds coming out of my mouth are pulling up the linguistic impressions that are latent in your mind and within your subconscious. So to make sense of what I'm saying, I'm pulling up those impressions. You're not receiving what I'm saying necessarily as if it's a new impression. We can do this through language, but language is such an automaton. You see a word, like say you see the word cat, and it's a C-A-T. You're not really seeing the word cat. You're seeing these lines that follow what you've learned to be as a C-A-T. And they could change the font. They could do it artistically, and you could still see the word cat there because your mind is superimposing the word cat on the visual image of the C or the half circle and the sort of triangle with the line in it and the line with the one going down. We're superimposing the word cat. on that visual image. So, and this happens all the time. The associative mind, you see something and associations come and latch onto it. So by learning to really develop the body brain, to develop the mindful awareness in the body brain, we are blocking that ability to naturally impose stuff by holding this in the back of our awareness. And it has to be done consciously with intent. We are actually able to receive new impressions, unadulterated and whatever. So sensing, coming back to our body, coming back to our breath, coming back to the sensation of self, as Mr. Gurdjieff described it, is such an important thing for us to do, because then it allows a certain natural progression and a natural development within ourselves. So people have heard me sort of say this and they've misunderstood what I've said, and they've accused me of only focusing on self-sensing. And they haven't understood that this is a preliminary, a prerequisite for the next step, which is then to become mindful of what we can see, hear, smell, and taste, which is head-brain external perceptions. So the most basic form of self-remembering is to consciously look, and while looking, to consciously hear, and while hearing, to consciously smell, and while smelling, to even consciously taste. So then this is the mindfulness of the head brain while sensing our body. So that's the next major step. And the third major step then is to bring the feeling brain and become mindful of our feelings. So that, we become a triangle. The top part is the head brain mindfulness, consciously looking, listening, smelling, and tasting, the receiving of impressions from the outside world, the body brain in terms of the sensation of self, and the feeling brain in terms of feeling. And so this is a very important thing for us to understand and for us to practice, to bring ourselves back into our physical body as often as we can, as often as we have the presence of mind to do so. So just become aware of your body, become aware of your breathing, become aware of the sensation of air as it flows in through your nose, back of mouth, throat, down into your vocal cords, and breathing back out again. Become aware of the touch of air on your body, the touch of clothing on your body. Become aware of the effect of gravity on your body, the pressure points where perhaps your feet are touching the ground, or the back of your buttocks, or the back of your thighs on the chair. Become aware of the sensation of self. Really try to maintain this awareness. And this is also some place where I have some problems with the way mindfulness is taught in the West. They do a very good technique called the body scan. And Mr. Gurdjieff had a technique that was called the filling exercise. So as a vessel fills with warm golden honey, to imagine the body filling with sensation, beginning with the bottom of the feet and slowly up to the top of the body. But I know many people who have taken the Western, mindfulness-based stress reduction program developed by Jon Kabat-Zinn, and they never really take it to the sensation of self. They continually do the body scan, which is breaking the body and breaking the sensation of self into manageable parts for people who are new to this. But the idea is to develop a greater and greater and greater awareness of ourself. And then wherever we are, whatever we're doing, if we have the presence of mind to bring ourselves back into our body, whether or not it's walking down the street, standing in a line, eating, having a shower, going to the toilet, our body is always there. Our body is our most loyal companion, and wherever we go, our body is with us. But in this world, we're taught to ignore the body. People take tranquilizers and sleeping pills to go to sleep. And then when they wake up, they guzzle coffee and caffeine to get awake. And it's like the body is this annoyance that they drag around with them. And they think that they're mental beings and, the thoughts and everything are more important. But everything is dependent on the body and everything is connected to the body. So let's do the filling exercise. As a vessel fills with warm golden honey, imagine your body filling with sensation, starting at the bottom of your feet, and then filling with sensation for your whole feet, filling with sensation from the bottom of your feet right up to your ankles, and then filling with sensation from the bottom of your feet up to your knees, and then filling with sensation from the bottom of your feet up to your hips, and filling with sensation from the bottom of your feet up to your hands, hips, lower torso, lower arms, and then filling with sensation from the bottom of your feet all the way up to your shoulders, filling with sensation from the bottom of your feet up to your neck, and then filling with sensation from the bottom of your feet all the way up to the top of your head. The phrase that Mr. Gurdjieff used, at least as it was translated into English, was the sensation of self, the development of the sensation of self. If you've read his book, Meetings with Remarkable Men, which was turned into a motion picture back in the 70s, very influential in Guido when Peter Brooks, the director, went to Colombia and gave a talk before the showing. But it came from a book, which is a biography that's allegorical. It's not a full biographical account of his life. But when Mr. Gurdjieff, I forget the age, around 12 years of age, he and another boy in his village developed an animosity and hatred because they were both interested in the same girl. C'est plus ça change. Things are always men fighting over women, boys fighting over women. And they decided they were going to have a duel. But they couldn't have a duel. But Kars, where he lived, there was a Turkish artillery range nearby. And so they decided that they had their seconds and they were going to go off and go into the artillery range overnight. And whoever survived would get the girl. And Mr. Gurdjieff described his own experience, the absolute overwhelming fear that he experienced, but it was a physical, bodily fear. And that's where he used the term sensation of self. He became acutely aware of his physical body that night when he was in the artillery range. He was unscathed. The other boy got a flesh wound and he had fainted, but he was okay, and they had to concoct a lie to tell their parents and everything. And he and the other boy forgot all about that girl and became best friends. And that boy actually became one of the seekers of the truth who went in search of the mysteries with Mr. Gurdjieff. And for myself, I was first introduced to the sensation of myself consciously in 1981 when I was 23 years old. But when I was 18, there was a major teacher strike in my province of Ontario in Canada, and they were on strike for 6 weeks. And I got a job going into southwestern Ontario. No one had ever taken soil samples of the region in southwestern Ontario to see if there were any minerals or deposits. And so I had a Volkswagen Beetle that I rented, or was rented for me, And every hundred, not a meter, but one, 1/10 of a mile, because we were still in miles back then. As soon as it went from 1/10 of a mile, I'd stop, run, hop over a fence, collect a soil sample, and then go and do it. And I did this all day. And at one point, I wasn't paying proper attention to the road, and I almost had a major accident with a car that was on a major highway going 60 miles an hour, and I was going to cross the highway, and he swerved. I didn't hit him. And then I crossed the road, and then I went down the road, and I saw the same color car zooming behind me, and I felt terrified. And I knew where the police station was. It was about 1.5 miles away, and my goal was to drive to the police station and let them confront me there. And I actually went up a railroad crossing, and there was another car coming the other way, and I was focused too much on the rearview mirror, and I wasn't fully in my lane, and I hit them just with the edge, and then I went down a 15-foot, not quite 15-foot, 10-foot, 12-foot embankment. In that moment, time stood still. It was quite incredible. But I crawled out of the car. I crawled up to the top of the road, and the guy was there with a gun pointed at my chest. And in that moment, I understood. Later, I understood what I realized then. I understood what Mr. Gurdjieff went through in that artillery range. I had a full and complete sensation of self, this complete connection to my physical embodiment in a way I may have experienced it as a child, but it was my first taste of it, sort of, and I was only 18, my first taste of it. And so when I was taught to self-remember and self-sensing was included, it was not difficult for me to do because I had that awareness within myself. And so I think it's actually, in retrospect, it's one of the more fortunate things that have happened to me in my life, even though from the outside and objectively it looks terrible, but from the inside, in terms of my own development, it really gave me a leg up when it came to this awareness of myself. Now, this awareness of myself is fueled by C12, which is the highest energy that the human organism naturally produces. But if we just focus on the sensation of self, it doesn't really lead to a lot of change. It has to be combined with the head brain and the feeling brain. And this is something that Mr. Gurdjieff talked about in great detail, even though I'm emphasizing the sensation of self. Mr. Gurdjieff said that many mystical traditions, particularly the monastic traditions that came out of Hinduism and Buddhism, all use a hack, so to speak, on their way to enlightenment. A hack, it's a term, life hacks, HACK. It's a expression that's entered into the vernacular, the common language of the internet. It's just a way of cheating things and doing them a little quicker and easier. But I'm going to pull up this diagram. So this, on the very left side, where my cursor is, I'm just wondering if I can get a pointer on this or not. Let's see. So this that I've outlined is the octave of food. It's the physical body. It's the development of the physical body. And we need this awareness. We need a development of this awareness so that when we begin to engage in the first conscious shock, that we have this in the background. Now, the first conscious shock actually occurs, and I'm going to right over here at Do, which is the octave of impressions, which is the head brain and the receiving of impressions. But within the old monastic traditions, within Buddhism, within Hinduism, when we think of spirituality in the West, we tend to think of the Hindu Buddhist experience of meditating. But we miss a lot of the ingredients for this. I mean, for instance, a lot of people involved in Buddhism today, you know, they're householders, they're married, or they have girlfriends or boyfriends. A lot of the sort of the monasteries are co-ed educational, so they have groups and things come in. The Buddha said only celibate monks can achieve enlightenment. Everyone else can perhaps position themselves for a better rebirth. And this is something, you know, you read Tricycle and various Buddhist magazines, they don't really emphasize that the whole monastic process was a cheat, a hack for the enlightenment process. And they started working on C12, on the body first. And while I say we need to develop this awareness first, it's just so that we can begin to do things in the proper way. Give me a second, and I've got another thing here. This comes from In Search of the Miraculous. And it's chapter 9, which is the most incomprehensible chapter because it contains the ancient alchemical science of transformation. The previous diagram I just showed you, I spent years working on this and turning it into that diagram in an attempt to understand it. But I'm going to read this. The second stage refers to the work of the human organism when a man creates a conscious, volitional shock at the point Do 48. That's the little circle thing that I did on the other diagram. In the first place, this volitional shock is transmitted to the second octave, which develops as far as So 12. So what he's saying is this shock that starts at Do 48 of the octave of impressions, so the consciously receiving and external impressions through our eyes, ears, nose, mouth, then has an effect. And he said the second octave, which is the octave of air. It's not the octave of body, the octave of air, which are emotions. So consciously receiving an impression gives the me 48 of the octave of air the sufficient energy to begin to develop up to the So 48. I'll just flip back to my other diagram so I can illustrate this. I don't know how if I can clean these. No. So receiving of an impression at Do 48 allows it to affect me 48, so it's able to produce So 48. So by receiving the impression, we allow our emotions to develop So 48, and this allows for the alchemical process to continue. So the same shock also enables the third octave to develop. So that's the octave of impressions, the head brain. It allows the octave of impressions to develop up to me 12 of the octave of impressions. And thus the second stage of the human, thus in the second stage of the work of the human organism, we see the full development of the second octave and the three notes of the third octave. Let me just go back. I want to try and get clear. I don't know. I'm still, in a sense, learning how to use this Zoom. Let me pull this up again. Cleared now. Oops.
Mine seems to be around.
I know. I'm unable to respond to her because I'm having these internet problems.
Yeah.
Meeting. So I'm going to stop sharing. So Mr. Gurdjieff said, the first octave is fully developed. Through the receiving of impressions at Do 48, it gives me 48 the opportunity to develop fully. So with the first conscious shock, not only do we have the development of the first octave, which is a natural development, but we also have the development of the second octave, the octave of air. So it allows this to develop up to So 12 and to tap in to La 6. Let me just go back to the text now. Oops. Thus, in the second stage of the work of the human organism, we see the full development of the second octave and the three notes of the third octave. The first octave has stopped at the note C12, the third at the note Mi12. Neither of these octaves can proceed without a fresh shock. And here it's important to understand the law of octaves, that, from Do to Re to Mi, the vibration increases, and then from Mi to Fa, there's a decreasing in vibrations, and then it increases again up until C, where there's a decrease between C and Do. And so between Mi and C, we require some kind of an outside shock to help the process continue. So just earlier we saw Do 48 of the octave of impressions acts as that outside shock with the right valence, the right energy, the right intensity for Mi 48 of the octave of air to develop. So the human organism at the end of the first conscious shock, C12 and Mi12 are the highest things that we produce. And here, neither of these octaves can proceed any further without a fresh shock. So here he's talking about the second conscious shock. The first conscious shock is self-remembering. And he doesn't really explain a lot about the second conscious shock. The nature of the second shock cannot be so easily described as the nature of the first volitional shock at Do 48. In order to understand the nature of this shock, it is necessary to understand the meaning of C12 and Mi12. The effort which creates this shock must consist in the work on the emotions, in the transformation and transmutation of the emotions. This transmutation of the emotions will then help the transmutation of C12 in the human organism. So we transform the emotions get to that valence, that energy of So 12. And it's like the normal Do 48. It doesn't, normally Do 48, the impressions received don't have the energy necessary to help the Mi 48 of the octave of air to develop. It has to develop a certain intensity. And this is the same for So 12. So no serious growth, that is no growth of higher bodies within the organism, is possible without this transmutation. The idea of this transmutation was known to many ancient teachings, as well as to some comparatively recent ones, such as the alchemy of the Middle Ages. But the alchemists spoke of this transformation in the allegorical forms of the transformation of base metals into precious ones. In reality, however, they meant the transformation of coarse hydrogens into finer ones in the human organism, chiefly of the transformation of Me-12. Me-12 is of the octave of impressions. It's the head brain. If this transformation is attained, a man can be said to have achieved what he was striving for. And it can also be said that until this transformation is attained, all results attained by a man can be lost if they are not fixed in him in any way. Moreover, they are attained only in the spheres of thought and emotion. Real objective results can only begin after the transmutation of C12 has begun. Alchemists who spoke of this transformation began directly with it. They knew nothing, or at least said nothing, about the nature of the first volitional shock. It is upon this, however, that the whole thing depends. The second volitional shock and transmutation become physically possible only after long practice of the first volitional shock, which consists in self-remembering and in observing the impressions received. On the way of the monk and on the way of the fakir, work on the second shock begins before work on the first shock. But as Me-12 is created only as a result of the first shock, work in the absence of other material has of necessity to be concentrated on C12, and it very often gives quite wrong results. Right development on the fourth way must begin with the first volitional shock and then pass on to the second shock at Me-12. Let's just get out of this now. So, the monks, the monastic tradition. If you understand what Mr. Gurdjieff is saying here, the whole monastic tradition is learning how to control C12. It's focused exclusively on C12. So we're attached to our name. We're very identified with our name. We are very identified with our family, with our lineage, with our bloodlines. So the monastic tradition actually involves, I like the Latin term fugamundi, fleeing the world. It involves leaving the world, changing our name. It involves perhaps shaving all the hair on our head, wearing saffron-colored robes, so that any kind of distinction, any kind of identification with our physical self is taken away. It involves celibacy. C12 is produced in the testes and the ovaries. It's produced in the reproductive organs, so that we hold this C12. Fashion, individuality. I mean, the fashion industry is fueled by the misuse of C12, the misuse of sexual energy. Mr. Gurdjieff said that the misuse of C12 is the center of gravity of most human gatherings. He said people go to church and they dress up to be seen by the opposite sex. And he was saying this in 1915. So it's the misuse of C12 that is so bad. And so you leave the world, you leave your family, you get rid of your name, you take on another name, you shave your head, you wear monastic robes, you live in a monastery, you get up every day and you meditate. And you get up the next day and you meditate. And in a true monastery, which they should be in the forest, away from cities, away from civilization, away from the temptation and the things that inflame and use C12. So in a monastery, there are no weekends. It's not like, oh, it's Friday, yeah. Today is like yesterday, which is like 1,000 years ago, which is like tomorrow. And the whole thing is to not allow C12 to be misused. So if you really explore the process of the monastic tradition and the various vows and restraints and the life that they have to lead and live, you will learn a tremendous amount about the misuse of C12, not because they misuse C12, but because of the elaborate ways they've gone to not misuse it. So today is the same as yesterday, which is the same as 1,000 years ago, which is the same as tomorrow. And any things in your life that may have been disturbing and that may have pulled you this way or that way are slowly allowed to settle. I mean, it's like a pond with the muck turned up, and that's most people's lives, and it's all dark water. And you go into the monastery, and over time, you don't go back and you don't try to fix your past. You don't try to, take care of all of that muddiness. You just allow it to all settle down. And over time, all of the particles in the water settle down and become sediments, and they become the bottom of the pond. And you don't want to run through the pond and disturb it. You want to maintain a degree of tranquility. You want to hold on to that. Now, this is where the Catholic Church made a major misstep. I mean, some of the monastic orders in the Catholic Church, like the order, I forget his name now, Thomas Merton, the famous Trappist monk, leaving the world. And then, they say that Thomas Merton may have fallen in love with a woman who was corresponding and visited him. And there's supposed to be that absolute separation from the world. So Catholic priests who take the vow of celibacy, and then they have congregations, and they have men, and they have women, and they have beautiful women, and they've got all of these distractions, don't properly develop. In order for that process to properly develop, we have to cut all ties with the world. We have to take vows of celibacy, the monastic vow, flee to a forest, change our name, do all of that, and stop misusing that energy. In other words, we cut ourselves off from the ways we can misuse that energy, which in the world is all sorts of ways. And so they develop that way, and that's why it's a hack. And it's this path and this process that when people think about spirituality, they think about the meditation, and they think about the various, Hindu yogis and Buddhist saints and, all of that. And so they have this artificial conception of the spiritual path. The fourth way, the goal of the fourth way is to work on ourselves in the world. And we do this through the understanding of the misuse of this energy. Now, C12, in its own right, properly and lawfully, is meant for a number of things. Number one, procreation. But it's also meant to lead to self-sensing. Let me bring back this. So it's meant to lead to self-sensing. The higher blends with the lower to meet in the middle. And I'm just going to use this center square. It's not quite right, and it is certain, to a degree it's right. The numbers are right. C12 of the octave of the body, of the octave of food, is supposed to meet with So 48 of the octave of food in order to transform into Law 24 of the octave of food. And we can see them over here. So 48, Law 24, and C12. Law 24 is actually a molecule. And this is the molecule that fuels the sensation of ourself. Every act of physical mindfulness, even just becoming mindful of the baby toe on my left foot, involves bringing C12 into contact with So 48, so the higher blends with the lower to meet in the middle as Law 24, and I experience this fuel, this energy, as the sensation of my little toe. So whenever we sense our entire body as one organic whole, we are using this energy properly. But C12, actually, I've got a better diagram than this for that. I'll get to it. Let me find it. So in this diagram, I've got the C12 in blue. Now 12 combines with 48 to get to 24. But somehow the octave of emotions, the emotional center, is able to steal C12, and it creates this abnormal growth, this abnormal molecule inside ourselves. And this is emotional identification. And it's incorrect to think that it's just negative emotions. And it's incorrect to think that negative emotions are all bad. This is a mistake of Uspensky, where he says all negative emotions are useless. Mr. Gurdjieff corrects this later when he's talking to other people, when he says that certain negative emotions have a very positive quality. Fear can be an aspect of clairvoyance, and it can be warning us. But it's like 99% of negative emotions are a direct result of the misuse of C12. And not just negative emotions, because positive emotions can also be the misuse of C12. Mr. Gurdjieff used the term vehemence. You know, whenever there's a vehemence, that this vehemence, the taste of this vehemence shows that C12 is being misused. But it's more than vehemence. My own personal exploration of this over many years is that negative emotions and positive emotions, you can tell. There's a taste to them that you can use this taste to recognize that it's the misuse of C12. And the taste is underneath them. There's the ego. So anger, if it's a misuse of C12, it's like, how can they do that to me? Don't they know who I am? I can't, and it's I, me, ego, ego, ego. But a lot of love between couples is of a lower order. Mr. Gurdjieff talked of 3 different loves: the love of World 48, the love of World 24, the love of World 12. And a lot of love, it's, oh, they make me feel so good, and it's me, me, me. And it's the ego. So the taste of the ego allows us to become aware that we are engaged in this misuse of C12. The octave of impressions, the intellectual center, is also capable of misusing C12. And this leads to head-brain identification, where we get so lost in something that we no longer exist. Go to a movie theater, suspenseful movie, and at the height of suspense in the movie, look around the theater and ask yourself how many people are actually present, how many people are in their bodies, or are they on the screen? They're so identified with what is going on in the screen that they've lost the awareness of themselves. And most people live in this state. Now, one of the chief means of, or chief ways we misuse this energy is through imagination and daydreaming. Now, contrary to what Ouspensky put in Search of the Miraculous, it's something that Mr. Gurdjieff cleared up with other students later. There is subjective imagination and there's objective imagination. There's a proper use of imagination. So not all applications and uses of imagination are bad. But when it takes the form of daydreaming, and the thing about daydreaming is there's an emotional component. And again, the ego is beneath it. This was one of my biggest problems. As a teenager, I loved retreating into my imagination. And it was like I was Walter Mitty. In my imagination, I was a very heroic being, and I would imagine myself into situations where I would pull people out of car wrecks and, all these, but underneath it, there was the taste of the ego, the taste of, I want to be this special kind of being and whatever. And all daydreaming, all misuse of imagination is also fueled by the ego. And so in many ways, this work, the fourth way, Mr. Gurdjieff's teachings, these ancient teachings, the most important dimension at the beginning, at the start, is learning how to stop misusing the energy of C12 and allowing it to be stolen by the other centers. And this is something that the monastic tradition, taking the vows of celibacy, leaving the world, changing your name, shaving your head, wearing saffron-colored robes, meditating, meditating, meditating. Slowly you stop misusing that energy, and then it allows a certain transformation to take place in this first octave, the octave of food. But Mr. Gurdjieff says that this is not good. He said that it leads to distortions, that the true way to evolve is in the world, but it's much harder to evolve in the world. Someone yells at you, you get mad because they're yelling at you. And inside, how can they yell at me, even if it's your boss? There's a sulkiness, there's a whatever. That's an indication of the ego. And actually, I should mention as well, for the head brain, one of the ways we misuse this is through attempting to win, to climb mountains, to be the first, to be dominant. This means that, something that seems so pure as the Olympics, it's not pure. Because there's the desire to win gold. There's the desire to get medals. There's the desire to be the best. This is why certain forms of martial arts, before they added competitions and all this stuff that's bringing C12 into it, they didn't do that. They kept it very pure. It wasn't about being the best. It was about being the best you could be. So the competitive element and the desire to be first, the desire to win races, write books, develop theories, get acknowledged, it's part of the misuse of C12 in the head brain. And if you look at it and you analyze it, underneath it, it's all ego. So we've got to learn how not to misuse this energy in the world. So we've got to really begin to look within ourselves. And where are we misusing this energy? Where are we wasting it? I remember when I first, 23 years old, I came across the Gurdjieff teachings. Dr. Christopher Holmes, a professor of psychology at York University, taught my class to self-remember and introduced me to the teachings. And, it just kind of blew me away. But I remember thinking, as I got into it and as I began to study more and whatever, I don't want to give up my daydreams. I don't want to, this was it seemed like such an important part. Now, I was very shy. I suffered from extreme social anxiety as a kid, especially as a teenager. So, I would imagine everyone in my class on Friday night being out with each other, and there I was in the basement alone. But I had my imagination, and it gave me comfort, and it helped me, but I didn't realize it was the misuse of this energy. That energy should be rightfully used for the sensation of ourself. And then we have to begin to ask ourselves, where are we leaking this energy? What forms of identification, habits, daydreaming, imagination, what ways are we allowing this to leak out of ourselves? Negative emotions, various different ways. And, Mr. Gurdjieff was really sly. He said that the fourth way was a quicker way than the other ways. And I don't really think it is. I think it has the potential to be a quicker way, but it is a more complete way. It allows us to develop all three brains. It allows us to stop misusing this energy. Mr. Gurdjieff actually said that Buddhism got distorted by the followers of the Buddha. What we know about Buddhism is that the first Buddhist texts, the first sacred scriptures in Buddhism, with the words of the Buddha, only entered into written form approximately 400 years after the death of the Buddha. But Mr. Gurdjieff, in his book Beelzebub Tales to his grandson, puts a phrase in the Buddha's mouth. And we attribute this phrase, us Gurdjieffians, attribute this phrase to Mr. Gurdjieff, and he attributed it to the Buddha. And I can't reproduce it exactly, but he said one of the highest attainments and one of the ways we stop misusing this energy, because this misuse of this energy, I don't want to go into it, get too complex, is also involved in what he called the organ kunda buffer. So he puts into the Buddha's mouth one of the best ways of preventing the misuse of the organ or getting caught up in the properties of the consequences of the organ kunda buffer is through learning to withstand the displeasing manifestations of others towards ourselves. So if someone yells at you and how dare you yell at me, and you may even be thinking this in your head, you're not withstanding the displeasing manifestations of another to yourself. Just to be non-reactive. Many stories of Mr. Gurdjieff going into tirades. Fritz Peters once saw Mr. Gurdjieff in this tirade against A.R. Orage. I'm one of the finest editors of the English language, who founded the very influential publication sort of at the turn of the 20th century called The New Age. He was a friend of George Bernard Shaw, discovered various people who are giants now in English literature. And Mr. Gurdjieff is screaming at him, and Fritz Peters was 12. And he talked about spittle coming from Mr. Gurdjieff's mouth. And then Mr. Gurdjieff looks at Fritz Peters, completely normal. And then he goes back. And Fritz Peters suddenly realized that Mr. Gurdjieff wasn't caught in a state of emotional identification. He wasn't the anger. He had control over the anger. In other words, that manifestation of his anger in that moment was not a result of the misuse of C12. His ego wasn't at play in it. And the thing is, there are numerous stories of Mr. Gurdjieff doing this to people. And they would just start collapsing and breaking under it. And then every once in a while, they'd go, oh. And they would stop reacting. And they would not let it get to them. And in that moment, Mr. Gurdjieff would stop. Thomas de Hartmann talks about this in his book, Our Life with Mr. Gurdjieff, which he wrote, and then before he could finish it, he died, and so his wife, Olga de Hartmann, finished it. But he talked about a point at the Prieuré near Fontainebleau, France, where Mr. Gurdjieff told him, now we're going to finally start to work on the emotions. And Mr. Gurdjieff would trip him up over and over and over again by yelling at him or, in a certain state, and he would get upset, and then he would go, this is what he meant by working on the emotions. It's not to allow the ego, it's not to allow the misuse of the C12 into that experience. So your boss yells at you, and rather than getting upset, it doesn't bother you. A few weeks ago, I had someone phone me up and scream at me for 20 minutes. And it was actually a wonderful experience for me. I mean, he phoned me up the next day and apologized. He was in such a raging state of identification, and he misunderstood things and made erroneous connections. But for me, it was a wonderful experience, because 10 years ago, I would have just been knocked over with that. And even knowing what I knew, I knew this theory and everything 10 years ago, and I knew it, but I think I would have succumbed to the state of emotional identification and been really hurt by it and whatever. And instead, it didn't bother me. It was like water off a duck's back. So we've got to find out where we are misusing this energy. Is it through our imagination? Is it through our daydreaming? Is it through negative emotions, even positive emotions that come from the ego and that are egotistically based? And my belief, actually, the misuse of C12 is responsible for the manifestation of the ego. C12, I call an energy of physical identification. It's like a spray that we really should be spraying on our physical body to develop the sensation of self. But when we begin to spray it on the world outside of ourselves through identification, I'm a Canadian, I'm a male, I'm an English speaking, all of these labels, these forms of identification, I'm identifying with something that's not real. Canada, and I've talked about this before, only exists in one place in this entire 14.5 billion light year universe, and it's in the minds of human beings. Canada is it's a hallucination. It's a collective hallucination, as is America, as is Colombia. The fish, I'm about a mile away or 2 miles away from Lake Ontario. And in the middle of Lake Ontario, at the bottom of the lake, there's this magical line between Canada and America. But do the fish that swim across that line see it? No. So many things that we've been sustaining, that we've been maintaining, that we've been growing. We've created these abnormal crystallizations within ourselves that are leading nowhere. And so we have to begin to work on this. We have to stop this and to begin to allow our development to proceed in a healthy, proper fashion. Any questions, any comments so far?
I had a question about, when I sense into the body, it seems to require a form of energy, in that I can maintain, when I'm intentionally doing it, I can maintain it for a while, and then I can feel it kind of like, the power goes out. If I'm understanding the diagrams and the C12 and all that correctly, by doing that, I'm also creating energy that, or I'm reclaiming the C12 that's being used.
Yeah.
So
you're actually, by doing that, everything we see, everything we hear, everything we taste, everything we smell, everything we sense, everything we feel. So these are the attributes of all three brains. And the head brain, it also includes, unfortunately, the words and the pictures in our mind. We're creating memories, the way we understand it in the West through modern psychology, but we are also leaving behind impressions. And it's more than impressions. We're leaving behind crystallizations. So, as a stalactite forms from millions of drops of water from the roof of a cave slowly coming down, every impression within us leaves a crystallization. Just a single crystallization is like pouring from the empty to the void. But when we repeat certain ones over and over, it's like the drops. And so part of our journey is to start using these impressions or these drops or these or to start using this energy to create proper crystallizations, proper formations within ourselves. And it's these higher level crystallizations that actually grow the Keshan body and the higher bodies within us. It's through this process. But we've also got to decrystallize a lot of stuff. That's not really answering your question. You want to repeat your question again?
There's the energy that I use to maintain the sensation of self, and then there's the reclamation of C12 that over time will develop from the sensation of self. And I guess I'm wondering what if there's anything we can do to increase the fuel needed to remember the self, because it doesn't seem to be a one-to-one thing.
Yeah.
If I'm remembering the self and I'm getting the C12, there's a part of my brain that's like, well, why isn't that just kind of giving me more energy to remember myself more? I'm sure I'm missing something there.
Mr. Gurdjieff said that at nighttime, he said we do, but he also implied that sometimes it doesn't quite work properly. At nighttime, we regain all of the energy that we need to work on ourselves. Most people waste this energy. They blow it up. Mr. Gurdjieff gave a number of different exercises, specifically how to enhance our sleep. So in other words, how to not waste this energy unnecessarily at nighttime. One of the exercises, and I have to confess I have real trouble doing this, is what he called the nightly review. And I understand this as a hypnotherapist. This is one of the major ways of helping someone to heal. It's transforming our life into the second person perspective. It's allowing an inward detachment to occur. And for my clients, I have them relive a traumatic childhood event, And as they go through it, I'm going, what happened next? What happened next? What happened next? And I'm taking elaborate notes. And then I have them reimagine themselves in a movie theater, perhaps with their 5-year-old self. And then they watch the scene with 5-year-old in it. And it's this detachment. It's this separation of the self from the self in one way that allows the healing to occur. And I figured this out because of this exercise. The exercise is called the nightly review. And you are just supposed to visually see yourself on the screen. So you don't go through your day as you saw it and you experienced it in the first person. You do it as a second person phenomenon. And you do this at bedtime. And you digest a lot of undigested emotions, digest a lot of undigested impressions, and you give yourself more energy to work the following day. Another important exercise, and this is one I do regularly, he talked about at nighttime, is to do a full body relaxation. In a number of places, he said that there are 3 muscles, large, medium, and small. And we have to learn to relax them all. And I spent hours Googling, trying to find out which were the large muscles in the body, which were the medium, and which were the small. And then I came across a passage in G.I. Gurdjieff, Paris Meetings 1943, where he actually says that the large muscles are the first ones we can relax. And if we properly relax them, then we move to the medium muscles. And if we properly relax them, we move to the small muscles. So there's an actual sequence of events. So to relax the large muscles is to begin with a big, major muscular relaxation. And then to move to the medium muscles is to relax inwards. And he said a lot of people even then can't do the third, the small muscles. But J.G. Bennett in his book Transformations talks about how Mr. Gurdjieff said it's very important at nighttime before bed to relax completely. And Bennett said it's best to do this sitting in a chair so you can do it properly. Otherwise, you will fall asleep through it. Bennett didn't analyze it the way I have. But what this does is it eliminates the first sleep cycle. So when we go to bed, our first sleep cycle is usually the body just doing that at a subconscious level. So if we do that at the conscious level, consciously before we go to bed, we don't have to engage in that process when we are in our first sleep cycle. They only know this through studies of mice, but mice are mammals and they've extrapolated to human beings. At nighttime, our short-term memory is re-encoded as long-term memory. The hippocampus, which is sort of like a horseshoe-shaped part of the brain, in the medial brain, that's, it's not the primitive and it's not the advanced, it's sort of in the middle, is the repository of our short-term memory. And at night, it gets transformed into the long-term memory. And this is part of the sleep process. It's what happens during the second, sometimes the first sleep cycle. And what they found in mice is that the visual memory, it's not the auditory, and the other stuff are all connected because we have holistic memories. But the visual representation of the day is unspooled backwards, turned into long-term memory. And so I believe that this is one of the functions of the nightly review, that when we engage in the nightly review, we are bringing into our conscious awareness and turning it into a conscious act something that happens in our subconscious. So by doing these things, we eliminate a lot of the stuff that, disturbs our sleep and whatever. And Mr. Gurdjieff also said, and I remember the first time I read this, where he said the conscious and the subconscious have to become unified. And I thought, this is ridiculous. The subconscious is so much bigger. And the more I thought about it, the more correct I realized Mr. Gurdjieff is. I've mentioned this before as well. Every act of mindful awareness involves the harnessing or the uniting of the conscious and the subconscious. A moment ago, your subconscious mind was fully aware of the bottom of your feet. Your subconscious mind was fully aware of the sensation of your lower back. Now that I'm bringing this into your conscious mind, your conscious and subconscious are moving into harmony. So by doing these exercises at night, we are actually bringing the conscious and the subconscious into alignment, because the conscious awareness is doing tasks that the subconscious mind normally does, thereby it frees it up. So these are two important exercises in terms of, conserving energy within ourselves. But Mr. Gurdjieff also said that a way to really begin to increase this energy, and this is something that I do, not as often as I should do it every night. He said to think of someone that was really important to you, someone that you loved, someone that you cared about who's died, and to imagine that you are with them and that you are sending them love and that you are connecting with them. And just by picturing them as you're in bed, I quite often picture my father or my mother or my brother and connect with them. He said by this way, we will accumulate more energy. And this is also why it's important in the morning to try to, first thing before we even get out of bed, stay and maintain that collected state. We wake up in a collected state and then brush here, there, get the coffee, but to be able to hold on to that, to not allow it to be disturbed, to be ruffled, so to speak. So these are different ways that we can increase our energy, that we can increase the output of this energy. And I have to say, I may have to go in 5 minutes. I've got a client who's supposed to come for noon. I'll see, only time I could book him. And he's not here yet. I thought he might come early, but there's something actually in my neighborhood called the Taste of the Danforth. So I'm 5 minutes away from the Danforth, where that shooting took place a number of weeks ago, and it's all blocked off. And they've got food pavilions and all the restaurants have booths, and so that's probably why they might not be here right away, because of the problems with the traffic. And so bring ourselves back to our body, back to our breath, back to the sensation of self. And Mr. Gurdjieff said, for the sensation of self, if we have to develop it, we develop it from the bottom of the feet to the top of the head. This should be preceded by relaxation, and relaxation should go from the top of the head down to the bottom of the feet. So if you're not in the relaxed state, if there are parts of you, and there's a physical form of identification where muscles can be, so we've got to begin with the relaxation of the body. I was very lucky. It's something that I didn't have to really work with. I had a brain injury when I was 10 in a car accident. Didn't even realize it at the time, but it gave me a certain mastery over my body, and it stopped my body from yelling at me and made me able to talk to my body. So I was able to do this, be in this relaxed state very easily. A lot of people, there's that physical identification and the tensions and the strains of the body, and that's wasting the energy. So learning how to let go of the body. And here things like yoga and Tai Chi are also very important in terms of relaxation, in terms of just calming that energy of the body down. Any other comments? Any other questions? I have a lot to think about. I did want to put this on a video, what the monastic traditions and all of that, to try to explain it a bit more. Hopefully people will gather and pick up on this. And, I'm surprised actually. People are, sending me messages. They're watching these. So, you never know. Anything else? I mean, this is also, this is sort of an aside, and it's not an aside. This is where the whole idea of mantras can also help. Mantras help us to keep the head brain on track. So mantras, prayers, holy affirming, holy denying, holy reconciling, transubstantiate for me in my being. When I'm thinking those thoughts, I can't be thinking other thoughts. And Mr. Gurdjieff also, he was very much a proponent on telling his students to learn a foreign language. Memorize 50 words in a foreign language a day as you're doing the work and whatever. And then he said the reason for this is when you're in the field digging, if you're going, uma, dois, tres, cinco, 14, 15, and you're thinking through a language, your mind is not wandering. It's not thinking about this and that. It's focused on something practical. So it's like taking this flow of mental energy and putting it into a proper channel. So a mantra, even a Hindu mantra, Buddhist mantras, Om Mani Padme Hum, all of these things are bringing the thoughts of the head brain into a certain channel so that we're not caught up in the head brain identification and we're not leaking that energy. So it's having mantras, having prayers, holy affirming, holy denying, holy God, holy firm, holy immortal, have mercy on us. All of these things are important. Ways of stopping that energy from leaking away and from being misused. But the mindful state, the state of self-remembering, the state of personal conscious is a higher energy than the mechanical state. So it's not as easy to do. And we run out of energy. And when we run out of energy, we can't continue. We've got to rest. And this is why Mr. Gurdjieff instructed his students, particularly those who were new to the work, to spend no more than a third of their waking time on inner work. And then he said the rest of the time, just let it go to the devil and just be normal and whatever, because it requires a tremendous effort and you don't want to blow a gasket or push things too far. So when you don't have the energy, I don't have the energy. I have to admit, when I want to go into the state of waking sleep, I go on Facebook. Or else I read online magazines, and I'm doing it specifically because I don't have the energy to maintain that awareness. And it's not a sin, it's not bad. I know what I'm doing, that I'm doing it for that. I need to just step into that lower energy state. This is also where Mr. Gurdjieff talked about that even a fully awakened being experiences all the different levels of consciousness. People who are not awake only experience the first two levels. People in the mindful state experience the first three. People who are awake experience all four states. But he said even a fully awake person has to exist in the other states. And he said that when he did work, in other words, money work, dollar business, when he valued antiques and stuff like that, he said he was half asleep. And when he really wanted to go to sleep, the state of waking sleep, he would go to the cinema, go watch a movie. So these enlightened beings who claim they're always enlightened and always in the state of enlightenment, people like Eckhart Tolle, it's not true. We go through different levels every day, and it's just part of being human. I have full access to sleep, and I have full access to waking sleep. They're my birthright, and I need to experience them, and I go through them every day. And to think otherwise is one of the other fallacies that comes out of the monastic tradition. At any rate, I would like to thank you all for coming. And Guido, we will be in touch this week, and Ian will be in touch this week as well.
Okay.
And, talk about the various things, continue with our discussion. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You take care.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.